Throughout history, there have been some truly bizarre stories of death row inmates who were expected to face their end in the most horrifying ways, only to walk away alive. From misfired execution attempts to strange acts of fate, these convicts had one thing in common: a second chance at life when no one expected it. Let's explore everything from the Mexican who just wouldn't die to the English child sentenced to hang for the crimes of others as we check out some of these crazy ways convicts survive death row executions. Number 10. Wenceslao Mogul surviving execution against all odds. Wenceslao Mogul Herrera was born on November 1, 1896 in Mérida, Yucatan, Mexico. He became a soldier and fought alongside the legendary revolutionary Pancho Villa during the Mexican Revolution, which raged between 1910 and 1920 after Villa's defeat in 1915 at the hands of the Federals. The revolutionaries who remained loyal to him were swiftly pursued and executed by the constitutionalist forces. 114. On March 18, 1915, Mogul was captured. At the time, he was only 25 years old, and he was immediately branded a traitor and sentenced to death by Colonel Ortiz. The execution was scheduled to take place the same day, without any trial. A common practice for the Federals during the Revolution, the method of execution was a firing squad, a standard form of execution. At the time, Mogul was positioned before a squad of 10 soldiers, 9 of whom fired at him simultaneously, aiming for his vital organs. The 10th soldier, standing ready, was assigned the task of delivering the coup de grace, a fatal shot to ensure his death. Despite being shot multiple times, Mogul miraculously survived. Playing dead in the hopes of fooling his executioners after the Federals left him for dead, Mogul managed to crawl away from the scene, covering 3 blocks to the Church of St. James Apostle, where he was discovered alive and brought to safety. Some accounts suggest that Mogul was found unconscious among the corpses of his comrades, yet survived long enough to be nursed back to health. His miraculous survival earned him the nickname El Fusilado, meaning the shot one. The shocking event led to Mogul becoming a symbol of survival against all odds. Despite being disfigured by the injuries, he went on to lead a relatively normal life, appearing on the famous Ripley's Believe It or Not radio show in 1937. Mogul also became the subject of a song by the British band Chumbawamba, which immortalized his incredible story. He lived a full life and passed away on July 29, 1976. At the age of 79, having defied death not once, but several times during his life. Number 9. William Duell, the boy who defied the gallows. William Duell's story is one that could have come straight from a dramatic Old English tale of survival and fate. Born in 1723, Duell was just 17 years old when he became involved in the horrific events that led to his death sentence. In September 1740, Sarah Griffin, a young woman from rural Worcestershire, was traveling back home from London due to her declining health. During her journey, she met Duell, who offered her shelter for the night at his barn in Acton. Once she had settled in, Duell went out and bragged to 5 other men about the lone woman staying with him. This tragic boast led the men to attack Sarah Griffin in a violent and brutal way. Sarah desperately tried to defend herself, claiming she had a disease to ward off the attackers, but they paid no attention to her cries. The men assaulted her repeatedly, beating her severely and robbing her before leaving her to die. She passed away the following day while receiving medical attention from a local surgeon. Duell was blamed for the crime because he had exposed Sarah to the attackers, and though he was still a minor, he was sentenced to death by hanging on November 24, 1740. William Duell was hanged at Tyburn alongside 4 others. He hung for a gruesome 20 minutes before his body was cut down and sent to the anatomy theater of the Worshipful Company of Barbers and Surgeons for dissection. But just as he was being prepared for dissection, one of the attendants noticed something extraordinary. Duell had started breathing, his breath grew stronger, and he began to regain consciousness. Remarkably, he sat up unaided. It turned out that Duell had been in a delirious fever during his trial and execution, which may have kept his body in a state of suspended animation, saving his life. The discovery of his survival caused a public sensation. Duell was quickly returned to prison, and after questioning, he could not recall the events surrounding his hanging. The authorities were astonished, and public opinion quickly shifted, with many believing that he had been given a second chance at life. As a result, his sentence was overturned and he was exiled to Boston, Massachusetts, where he spent the remainder of his life. He lived to an old age, passing away in his 80s, his survival at the gallows forever part of his extraordinary story. Number 8. Doyle Hamm, a horrific execution gone wrong. Doyle Lee Hamm, an American criminal, made headlines in 1987 when he was sentenced to death for the brutal murder of Patrick Cunningham. Hamm had a troubled upbringing and a long history of criminal activity. Growing up in a family steeped in crime with his father and several brothers incarcerated, Doyle's life path seemed inevitable. He was involved in a string of offenses, including burglary and assault, before his final crime spree. On January 24, 1987, Hamm murdered Cunningham, a motel clerk. During a robbery, he stole a gun, money, and the clerk's wallet before fleeing. Following his arrest, Hamm was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. But his case took an unexpected turn in the 1990s when it was revealed that Hamm suffered from fetal alcohol syndrome and had an IQ of 66, factors that were never properly addressed during his trial. In 2014, while on death row, Hamm was diagnosed with cancer and his health deteriorated rapidly. In 2018, Alabama scheduled his execution, but it would not go as planned. Hamm's veins were so damaged due to his illness that the execution team struggled to find an appropriate spot to administer the lethal injection. Despite multiple attempts, they failed to find a usable vein, and Hamm was repeatedly poked with needles. After bleeding profusely, Hamm was removed from the chamber, making him the fourth person in U.S. history to walk away from an execution. Ultimately, Hamm was not executed. Instead, he continued his prison sentence until he passed away in 2017 from cancer-related complications. His case raised important questions about the humane treatment of prisoners, especially those with severe medical conditions. Number 7. Rommel Broom, a botched execution that ended in legal battles. Rommel Broom's life was marked by a pattern of violent crime. In 1975, he committed the horrific rape of a 12-year-old girl, followed by a string of robberies. He was sentenced to prison but was released on parole in 1984. Soon after, he attempted to abduct another girl, Vanita McKinney, but was thwarted by two neighbors. Just days later, Broom abducted and murdered 14-year-old Trina Middleton. His crimes escalated, leading to his conviction and death sentence. Despite his violent history, Broom spent years on death row, waiting for his fate to be sealed. On September 15, 2009, Broom's execution was set to take place. However, after 2 hours of attempts to find a usable vein for the lethal injection, the execution was called off. Broom had been punctured 18 times, but none of the attempts were successful. This led to a legal dispute, with Broom arguing that being subjected to a second execution attempt would violate the constitutional ban on cruel and unusual punishment. His case reached the Ohio Supreme Court, which ruled that the execution could proceed in 2016. After years of appeals and delays, Broom's case was finally resolved when he passed away in prison in December 2020 from complications related to COVID-19. His botched execution attempt and the years of legal wrangling surrounding his death sentence became a part of the ongoing debate over the fairness and effectiveness of the death penalty. Time for the fancy topic. A man who was sentenced to death by electric chair in the 1940s survived the execution. The story of his survival became one of the most shocking and strange cases in criminal history. The man, who had been convicted of a serious crime, was strapped into the electric chair and prepared for execution. As the switch was flipped, the prison officials, expecting the usual result, were left in disbelief when the man remained alive. The first jolt did not kill him, and neither did the second. After multiple attempts, he was finally declared dead, but his survival story didn't end there. It was discovered that the man had miraculously survived the electric shocks but had been severely disfigured. His face and body were marked by the burns and scars from the violent jolts, leaving him almost unrecognizable. His facial features had been horribly altered, causing him to appear almost like a completely different person. The photographs of his disfigured face became famous, shocking the world. The authorities and medical experts were baffled by his survival, as such a result was nearly impossible. Some speculated that a malfunction in the electric chair's wiring may have played a role in his unexpected survival. Others suggested that his body had some rare medical condition that allowed him to withstand the shocks. Despite his disfigurement, the man was given a second chance at life. He lived for many more years after the failed execution. Becoming a symbol of survival against all odds, his story remains a chilling reminder of both the power and unpredictability of the electric chair. Do you think the electric chair should still be used in executions today? How do you feel about the man's unexpected second chance at life after such a traumatic experience? Let us know in the comments with the hashtag fancy topic. Number 6. And Green, a tale of survival against all odds. And Green, a servant in 17th century England, became the center of a bizarre story that still fascinates historians today. Born in 1628 in Steeple Barton, Oxfordshire, Green worked as a scullery maid in the household of Sir Thomas Reed. Her life took a dark turn when, at 22 years old, she became pregnant by Sir Thomas's grandson, Geoffrey Reed. Green claimed that she was seduced and unaware of the pregnancy until she had a miscarriage at 17 weeks. Panicked, she attempted to hide the remains of the fetus, but was caught and accused of infanticide. Despite a defense that suggested no intentional harm, Green was convicted under the 1624 English law, which presumed any woman who concealed a child's death had murdered it. Her execution was set for December 14, 1650. When she was hanged at Oxford Castle, her friends pulled at her legs to hasten her death, while a soldier struck her with his musket to try to speed up the process. After hanging for over half an hour, Green was presumed dead and sent to the University of Oxford for an autopsy. However, when the physicians examined her body, they discovered a faint pulse and signs of life. The doctors quickly revived Green, and after 12 to 14 hours, she regained full consciousness. In a stunning twist, she was pardoned after 30 days and allowed to leave prison. Green later went on to live a full life, marry, have children, and pass away in 1659. Her incredible survival from the gallows became a symbol of the unpredictability of life. Number 5. Willie Francis, the teenager who survived the electric chair. Willie Francis, a 17-year-old from Louisiana, became known as the black teenager who was executed twice due to a botched execution attempt that left him alive. In 1946, Francis was arrested for the murder of Andrew Thomas, a pharmacist, but his case was riddled with issues. Many believe Francis was wrongfully accused, as the evidence against him was circumstantial and a confession was allegedly coerced by authorities. Despite these flaws, Francis was convicted and sentenced to death. On May 3, 1946, Francis was taken to the electric chair known as Gruesome Journey for his execution. However, a drunken prison guard had set up the chair incorrectly, and the resulting current failed to kill Francis. Witnesses reported Francis screaming in agony as the electricity surged through him, but he did not die. Instead, he was left with his hair burned off and his body severely damaged, but he survived the execution. Francis's case was taken to the U.S. Supreme Court, but his appeal for re-execution was rejected, and despite the constitutional protections against double jeopardy, the court allowed the state to retry the execution. Less than a year later, on May 9, 1947, Francis was strapped to the electric chair once more. This time, the execution went according to plan, and he was pronounced dead at 12:10 p.m. The tragic story of Willie Francis highlights the disturbing flaws in the criminal justice system and remains a stark reminder of the inhumane aspects of capital punishment. Number 4. John Babacom Lee, the man who couldn't be hanged. John Henry George Babacom Lee's story is one of the most unusual cases of survival in British criminal history. Lee, a man with a criminal past, was accused of murdering his employer, Emma Keyes, in 1884. Emma Keyes was found brutally killed with a fractured skull and slashed throat, and although the evidence against Lee was circumstantial, he was convicted of her murder. Keyes' death was gruesome, and Lee's supposed motive was never fully clear, leading to skepticism about his guilt. Throughout the trial, Lee maintained a calm demeanor, which only heightened the suspicions of those who believed he might be innocent. Nevertheless, the jury convicted him, and Lee was sentenced to death by hanging, a fate he seemed to accept quietly. On February 23, 1885, Lee was taken to the gallows at Exeter Prison to be executed. However, what followed became one of the most baffling moments in criminal history. As the executioner tried to pull the lever that would drop Lee through the trapdoor, the apparatus malfunctioned. Despite the execution team's repeated attempts to make it work, the gallows failed to function. With the platform malfunctioning, the executioners were forced to stop the procedure, puzzled by the strange turn of events. This was not just a simple technical glitch, it was a complete failure of the execution device. After several more attempts, it became clear that the trapdoor mechanism had somehow broken, preventing Lee from being hanged. Authorities, now thoroughly bewildered, tried the device again, but it malfunctioned a second time. Lee, still standing on the gallows, was removed from the platform and returned to his cell. This bizarre sequence of events prompted a widespread belief that it was a sign of divine intervention, a mysterious twist of fate that hinted at Lee's innocence. Many believe that the malfunction was a supernatural act, suggesting that Lee might not be guilty of the crime for which he was convicted. The Home Secretary, Charles Matthew, commuted Lee's death sentence to life imprisonment, citing the divine will that seemed to protect him. Lee's miraculous survival led to widespread public interest, and his case quickly became famous. For the next 2 decades, he spent his life behind bars, where his story continued to capture the imagination of the public. In 1907, after serving 22 years in prison, Lee was released a free man despite his original conviction for murder. His life took an unexpected turn when he began exhibiting himself as the man who survived 3 hangings to earn a living. The strange circumstances surrounding his case have continued to intrigue people to this day. His survival, which seemed nothing short of miraculous, raised questions about the justice system, the possibility of wrongful convictions, and the very nature of fate. Was Lee's escape from death a sign of innocence, or just a series of incredible coincidences? The mystery of the failed executions and his subsequent release is one of the most remarkable and enduring stories in British criminal history. It serves as a reminder that sometimes life can take the most unexpected turns, and the line between justice and fate can sometimes blur in the most inexplicable ways. Number 3. Ali Reza's second chance at life. In 2013, Ali Reza M., a 37-year-old man from Iran, found himself sentenced to death after being convicted of smuggling crystal meth into the country. He had been caught with a kilogram of the drug, and Iran's strict anti-drug laws left little room for leniency. In fact, Iran is known for its harsh penalties for drug trafficking, with the death penalty being a common sentence for offenders caught with large quantities of narcotics. His case drew attention when, on October 9th of that year, he was executed by hanging in Bajnar prison. The execution itself followed the typical process. Ali Reza was hanged, and after being left to die for 12 minutes, he was declared dead and sent to the morgue. However, the story took an extraordinary turn the following day. As a worker prepared his body for collection, they noticed something alarming. Condensation had started to form under the plastic covering, suggesting that Ali Reza was still alive. Initially, this was written off as a mistake or an oversight, but upon closer inspection, it was confirmed that Ali Reza had somehow survived the hanging. In a miraculous twist, he was rushed to a nearby hospital where medical staff worked tirelessly to revive him. Hours of intensive treatment later, Ali Reza regained consciousness. This astonishing survival story quickly made headlines across the globe. Despite his survival, Iranian authorities initially insisted on proceeding with the original death sentence. They argued that because Ali Reza was still alive, his execution had not been completed and should be carried out as per the law. This led to a wave of controversy, both domestically and internationally. Human rights organizations, including Amnesty International, condemned the decision, arguing that executing someone who had already technically died and been revived would violate international human rights principles. The situation reached a critical point when Iran's justice minister intervened, stating that Ali Reza would not be executed again. This decision was met with relief and applause from the international community, especially those advocating for reform in Iran's judicial system. Ali Reza's incredible survival, coupled with the intense global pressure, ultimately led to a reprieve. He was granted a second chance at life, though the experience left him with both physical and emotional scars. In the years following, Ali Reza's case remained a powerful reminder of the unpredictability of life and the astonishing resilience of the human body. It also highlighted the sometimes contradictory nature of the justice system in countries with rigid and severe laws. His ordeal stood as an example of how fate can intervene in unexpected ways, and how, even in the direst of circumstances, survival can defy all odds. Ali Reza's story sparked widespread debate about the use of the death penalty and whether such extreme measures should be carried out when there is even a slight possibility of error. Number 2. John Half-Hinge Smith, the man who survived execution. 3 times John Smith, a notorious criminal in 18th-century London, became a legend after surviving not 1, not 2, but 3 execution attempts. Born in 1661 in the quiet town of Malton, England, Smith initially served in the British Navy before being discharged after the Battle of Vigo Bay. He then enlisted as a soldier, where he fell in with a bad crowd. By 1705, Smith's life had taken a dark turn, leading him into a career in housebreaking. It was during this time that he was caught and sentenced to death for his crimes. On December 25, 1705, Smith stood on the gallows at Tyburn, the infamous execution spot in London, ready to meet his fate. As the executioners tightened the noose and dropped Smith from the platform, the crowd waited for his death. However, something went horribly wrong. Smith's body remained active, and instead of dying, he struggled in a desperate attempt to survive. The onlookers, including his own family, began to panic and even helped tug at his legs to speed up the process. But Smith wouldn't die for 15 long minutes. He hung there, gasping for air, before the crowd demanded he be cut down. Miraculously, after being revived, Smith regained consciousness. This led to him earning the nickname Half-Hanged Smith. After his miraculous survival, Smith was sent to a nearby house to recover. When asked about his experience, he recalled an intense pain from the weight of his body and a blinding flash of light before he lost consciousness. The reprieve he received from the court allowed him to live another day. Despite this incredible escape, Smith returned to his life of crime, and in a bizarre twist, he was caught again in 1706 for housebreaking. This time, a jury acquitted him, much to the amazement of many. Not to be deterred by his earlier lucky escapes, Smith committed crimes once more, eventually being captured for the 3rd time. His fate seemed sealed, but once again, he managed to avoid justice. The prosecutor in his case died just a day before the trial, and once again, Smith was released. For a man who had cheated death twice, this was seen as yet another example of his miraculous luck. However, by 1727, Smith's luck had finally run out. At the age of 66, now going by the name of John Wilson, Smith was caught for attempting to steal a padlock. This time, there was no escaping his fate. He was sentenced to transportation to Virginia. Marking the end of his notorious run of evading death, Smith's story has remained part of British folklore, a tale of survival, luck, and the strange ways in which fate can intervene. Number 1. Zuleika Kokoda, surviving a brutal stoning in Iran. The story of Zuleika Kokoda is one of survival in the face of unimaginable brutality. In 1997, Kokoda, a woman from Iran, found herself the victim of the country's strict laws regarding adultery. She was arrested, charged with extramarital relations, and sentenced to death by stoning, a cruel and horrific form of execution. According to Iranian law, when someone is convicted of adultery, the punishment is often death by stoning, where the individual is buried in the ground and pelted with stones until they perish. This is precisely the fate that awaited Kadkota when she was sentenced by a religious magistrate in the village of Aliabad. On the 11th of August, 1997, Kadkota was taken to an open field where she was buried up to her waist in a ditch, and the stoning began. A crowd, including both civilians and government officials, launched stones at her mercilessly, causing severe injuries to her head and face. Despite the brutal assault, Kadkota managed to remain conscious and alive. Though it seemed clear that she would not survive much longer, as the rocks continued to fall on her, an unexpected intervention occurred. Outraged by the violence, a group of villagers rallied together to stop the stoning. They rushed to dig her out and carried her to the nearest hospital in Buchan, where medical professionals worked to stabilize her, although rumors circulated that Kadkota would face another round of stoning. The authorities were under intense pressure from local communities and human rights organizations to grant her a reprieve. According to Iranian law, if someone survives the stoning, they are spared from death. This legal loophole played a crucial role in saving Kadkota's life. After surviving the attack, she was granted medical treatment, and later that year, her death sentence was officially lifted. International human rights groups had been involved in her case from the beginning, advocating for her release and calling for an end to stoning as a form of punishment. In November of 1997, after recovering from her injuries, Kadkota was freed from prison. The case drew widespread attention both within Iran and internationally, highlighting the continued use of stoning as a form of execution in some parts of the world. Her miraculous survival and subsequent release sparked debates about human rights, justice, and the cruelty of such practices. Kadkota's story serves as a reminder of the harsh realities faced by women under certain regimes and the power of collective action to save a life. Although scarred physically, she lived out the remainder of her life free from the threat of further violence, her name forever etched in history as one of the few who survived such an ordeal. Do you think these people were lucky to get away with not being executed, or was justice actually served when they escaped their truly terrible fate? Thanks for watching, and let us know in the comments below.
See you next time.